Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This morning's briefing is going to be in part about the president of Harvard, who happens to be a black woman, and about the hysteria and the outrage over so-called anti-Semitism on these Ivy League campuses. Claims that have not actually been proven, but there's lots of invective. But before we get to that, I want to give credit to our brother Tarian Rain. He's one of our long-time new voices of black media folks. He's been out here for a minute. He made a video talking about Harvard's Z-list, and I thought that was actually very appropriate, and it dovetails nicely with the subject that I was going to tackle, so we'll kill two birds with one stone. When you look at Harvard, they have the Z-list, which is basically, in short, a list of students who are allowed in because their parents or some sort of close relative or what have you gave huge amounts of money to Harvard, so because of that, they bought their way into the school. This is very important because we have a whole bunch of these white right-wingers out here trying to make a crusade out of saying that, it's black students who are getting into these schools and they're not qualified. Now, of course, neither Ed Blum nor the rest of his gaggle of idiots can actually show any black students who aren't qualified to get into these schools. They never give anybody any examples. It's all just innuendo and lies. All they do is present some white, or in the case of Ed Blum's nuisance suit about affirmative action, some Asian students who claim that they were denied admission, some vague banter about they didn't get into the school they wanted, and then they make some indistinct, unfounded insinuations that black students are to blame. And nobody ever stops to demand that they show exactly who these undeserving black students are. Nobody ever demands proof, and that's the point. Now, if Ed Blum truly wanted to go after people who don't deserve to be in these schools, then he'd be going after these Z-list individuals, but he's not, and that's because he represents the people who pay the money to get on the Z-list. That's who he actually represents. People who had to buy their way into Harvard because the black students earned their way in. Now, how many are white students on that Z-list? How many are Asian students buying their way into Harvard? This is why the Ed Blums and his kind are constantly trying to manufacture hysteria against black students. It's to cover for himself and the real undeserving people who these elite schools are being paid to let in. And what he's doing isn't helping these schools at all. The endowments for these Ivy League schools are greater now than they've ever been. This after 50 plus years of affirmative action. Things are better than they've ever been for these schools. They're more prestigious now than they've ever been. Business for these universities has never been better. And that's the real problem Ed Blum has. The white supremacists are ultra hypersensitive to anything that even remotely looks like a threat to their power. And when they see a world that is showing it will go on without these white supremacists, that makes them lose their minds. It was the prosperity of the Black Wall Streets that touched off a several years-long spree of white mobs going on racial rampages. The Black Wall Street showed them something that terrified them. A world where they weren't in charge, a world that didn't need the white supremacists. Harvard will always be able to brag that Barack Obama got his law degree from their school, and that he was the first non-white editor of the Harvard Law Review. Like him or not, and you know how I feel about Barack the backstabber, his presidency is still a historical precedent, and as a result, where he went to university will always be something of a novelty. Barack Obama didn't need affirmative action, though Clarence Thomas did. Clarence Thomas admitted that affirmative action was what made the difference between the first 17 years of his life and the second 17 years of it. So it's all just lies, it's all just phony political theater by individuals who will say any lie they have to just to try to get their way. Not one of these universities that Ed Blum pretends to be sticking up for made any sort of complaints. They weren't the ones who filed these nuisance suits. It wasn't Harvard or Yale or Columbia or any of the other Ivy League schools or any universities at all that said, we don't want to have any sort of admission standards. They didn't do that. Ed Blum decided he was going to volunteer himself to do that. And why? It's because the one thing white supremacy was created to do was to ensure that there would never be a level playing field. Black people don't need racial privilege to succeed, but the Ed Blums do. Without white privilege and the system of goodies, giveaways, and guarantees that it hands to those classified as white, Ed Blum wouldn't have anything. This clown couldn't win a lawsuit until the Federalist Society finally got a critical mass of its right-wing flunkies on the bench. This idiot spent 30 years on his anti-black crusade making no progress. Now the question is, why didn't he spend the last 30 years just going to the legislature and getting legislation instead? It was because, as another Federalist Society bigot Antonin Scalia said in his ruling on Shelby v. Holder, the legislatures will never repeal these measures because the voters wouldn't like it and the politicians are scared they get voted out of office. So this is not a war merely against black people, this is a war against democracy itself. The Ed Blums and his type, they have to go to the courts because the legislatures are a non-starter. Harvard has a Z list, but do you seriously think that they're the only ones? Of course not. W is an illiterate caveman, and yet somehow he got into Yale. Now, does anyone doubt that he's a white privilege admission case? And speaking of white privilege admissions, Ron DeSantis, Florida's favorite fool, was also a Yale graduate. That moron can barely spell law, much less practice it. How the hell did he get a law degree from Yale? That tells you everything you need to know about not only how he got in, but also how he got his degree. Or do you believe that people who were too dumb to get themselves into these schools based on grades somehow became Ivy League caliber students while they were there? No. Money is what got them in, and money is what purchased their degrees for them. They didn't have to worry about grades. The same way they try to claim that these black college athletes, they don't have to worry about grades as long as they perform well on the college basketball or football team. That's what makes the grade for them. They'll always be able to pass their classes as long as they perform on the courts. Yeah, well, this is what happens with the white privilege admissions. The Ron DeSantises and the W's and the rest of these pampered privileged punks, they already know that they don't have to make the grade in order to get in these schools or stay in. It's already been arranged for them well in advance. You see, the whole talk about diversity admissions is a lie, and the people saying it know it. You can't get into these schools unless your grades are tip-top. All affirmative action did was merely to request that the schools make an honest attempt to consider non-white students. That's it. On the other hand, white privilege admissions are quite real, and a disproportionate number of the students on these campuses are there because of it. They don't go to these schools to learn. You can see they're mumbling morons out here in the real world. They go to these schools to network, to meet the people who they're going to be getting a leg up from after they graduate. This is where they make their connections and their buddies and their little insider circles. That's why these rich white celebrities talk about how they can't wait to go to college and party full time. Remember that scandal? They treat these schools as social clubs because for them, that's what they truly are. Their status and their future prospects in life aren't based on hard work because white supremacy is about guaranteeing outcomes that are handed to people based on color, not effort. They want to be handed the same results that black students and black people in general have to earn through hard work. And the white supremacists aren't alone. I and others in the black media told you about how rich or otherwise connected Asian students have also been doing the same thing. So when you see people like Dinesh D'Souza and Vivek Ramaswamy and Mindy Kaling's brother who lied about being denied admission to a school on account of being Asian, but then admitted that he claimed to be black, you see the same practice. DeSantis' campaign is going down in flames because he's so smart. The only reason that he's governor of Florida is white privilege. The only reason Fox News gave him so much free airtime, which amounts to free campaign ads, is because of white privilege. I'm convinced that this weird-looking walking birth defect is in fact a malicious alien from another planet, clearly one that has no intelligent life. Now, as mentioned earlier, while we're on the subject of Harvard, Harvard has a black woman as its president now. She was installed back in July. And she was on Capitol Hill this week because Republicans wanted to manufacture some sound bites for Fox News so that they can do some fundraising off of it. This is what they always do. They'll call for some panel. They'll tell some folks, you need to come in and testify before Congress. When they do, they sit there and scream and yell, admit the truth. You're a commie, aren't you? And then they go on Fox News and say, see, I'm taking it to the libs. Now give me some money. Now, the white media made much ado about the fact that you had the president of the University of Pennsylvania and the president of Harvard, Claudine Gay, who were testifying before Congress regarding the claims that there's anti-Semitic violence on these college campuses. Now, the first thing that needs to be known is there hasn't been any violence at all. Nobody has been beaten up. Nobody's been struck. Hell, nobody's even had the finger pointed in their faces. Instead, what they're talking about is they said somebody said from the river to the sea, and apparently somebody looked and said, that's calling for genocide. Now, interestingly, when you had Nazis, real ones, who were on a college campus and they were screaming, Jews will not replace us, where was all of this concern then? Where was all of this attention and committee hearings then? There weren't any. Now, Elise Stefanik from New York, she was the congresswoman who apparently asked the question about, yes or no, tell me if calling for genocide is against Harvard's rules of conduct or what have you. And the part that apparently was seen as being worthy of headlines was that these two women who are the presidents of these respective universities, they gave answers that basically were hedging. The answers that they gave was, well, it depends on the context. It depends on what's being said. They essentially gave a Bill Clinton answer. It depends on what the definition of is. Now, why would they give a hedging answer like that? Because the Republicans have been attacking these universities full time for decades now. For generations, they've been doing it. They knew that Elise Stefanik and the rest of that Republican-controlled House of Representatives didn't call these two college presidents to Capitol Hill for a good faith discussion of the ideas and the issues. They were called there so that they could be yelled at and screamed at, so that Elise Stefanik could go on Fox News and say, see, I'm taking it to the libs. They knew that that's what it was about. So what happened was, you had, especially with the case of the University of Pennsylvania president, she was trying to play a game of verbal chess, and she lost. She made the wrong move. Now, in the case of Claudine Gay, she was a lot more diplomatic about it, but still, there were people who were trying to get a yes or no answer to something that actually is almost never yes or no, especially when you don't provide any examples of what the alleged calls for genocide are. It's all political theater, it was obvious from the start, and that was the reason why they gave the responses that they gave. And the white media looked at it and said, okay, we think we have something we can run with here. At the very least, we got some grist for the mill for this day's news cycle. Now, I consider it doubly perverse that Elise Stefanik was the one talking about whether killing people on campus was against Harvard's rules, because Elise Stefanik did more than defend threats of violence. She actually gave her approbation to the violence of January 6th when she voted against certifying Biden as the winner, even after the Capitol insurrection. And she also repeated the claims that there were voting irregularities, judges handing down illegal rulings in regards to Trump's lawsuits, and that state officials were being corrupt. She defended all of the false bases for the insurrection. And here she is talking about defending anti-Semitic violence on campus. I think the real reason Stefanik is so furious at the president of Harvard was because last year, Harvard's Institute on Politics removed Congresswoman Stefanik from her so-called advisory role. And what advice was this empty-headed goofball giving to Harvard? I don't know. About the only thing she's qualified to give advice on is what combo meal to buy at McDonald's. But for idiots like her, she needs to be validated. This is part of the social proof that is supposed to show how important she is. Elise Stefanik actually went to Harvard, if you can believe that, which is yet another example of a white privilege admission. Just goes to show they're not letting these people in based on grades. They're doing it based on connections and whether or not their folks can pony up the money to make Harvard look the other way. Stefanik was furious about the fact that she got kicked off of Harvard's Institute of Politics last year. I mean, her own alma mater was expelling her. She's a Harvard alumni, and worse, a member of Congress. To her, this was a grand humiliation. How could Harvard have rejected her white privilege? She's a member of Congress. Shouldn't they have felt honored to say that she was on some anonymous, unimportant, do-nothing institute of theirs? Please. Harvard is where most of America's presidents come from. She's not special to them, but she's butthurt about it, and she vented her spleen on TV. Just goes to show these creeps may grow older, but they never grow up. This is not to say, though, that the president of Harvard is necessarily on our side. She's not. She's on her own side, just like the rest of the black misleadership class. Though that's not to say that she's liked by the very people who she's depending on for her livelihood. She's surrounded by a whole bunch of wolves who have been licking their chops. Bill Ackman is a billionaire and a former Harvard student. He's also a huge donor to Harvard University, as well as to the Democratic Party. This Ackman character has been attacking Claudine Gay since before she was president of Harvard. In fact, he's been making sure to tell anyone who would listen that the only reason that Claudine Gay is even the president of Harvard is because of her race and her gender. This is what this guy's been doing. And he hasn't been doing this just for a few days. He's been doing this for months on end. This man is a big donor to the Democratic Party. Just goes to show this pampered racist has no problem supporting Democrats, and you gotta wonder why that is. Perhaps because he knows that the Democrats hate black people as much as he does, and that their job is to be controlled opposition, working for big money puppeteers like himself. His nonstop attacks on Claudine Gay are just like Ed Blum's nuisance suits. It's classic white privilege projection. Ackman is excruciatingly aware that he owes every crumb of his daily bread to his race and gender, so as he sees it, everyone else must be doing the same thing. And he thinks that because he's given millions of dollars to Harvard University, that if he snaps his fingers, or if he says, I don't like something, apparently the entire world is supposed to stop spinning on its axis just because he got his nose bent out of joint about something. And when Harvard in general and Claudine Gay in specific didn't bow down to his absurdly nihilistic demands, this guy has been throwing a huge temper tantrum ever since. Claudine Gay has been his target of choice. He's been leading the charge to scandalize her by claiming that she committed plagiarism in the hopes that this, combined with his ginned-up hysteria about anti-Semitism on campus, would be enough to pressure Harvard's board to fire her. Harvard's board, however, said they want her to keep her job. You see, Amman is worth about $3 billion, but Harvard as an institution is worth $51 billion. Sure, they appreciate the millions of dollars that he's given them, but it's a drop in a very large bucket compared to what their overall endowment is. They're not going to go out of business without him. His own prestige, however, is linked to the institutions that he's connected to, and they don't come more prestigious than Harvard. Amman needs them more than they need him, and that's why he's so mad. Amman has 1 million followers, or rather suck-ups, on Twitter, and among his fans is Christopher Rufo, who boasted that the phony outrage that we're seeing about alleged anti-Semitism on college campuses wouldn't have been possible without billionaires like this Amman character who have the money to make something out of nothing. See, the reason you had school boards where people showed up screaming and yelling in front of the cameras was because rich right-wingers paid crisis actors to go to these school boards and to do that. People who in many cases didn't even have children in those schools. People who in many cases didn't even live in those school districts. They were just this satanic carnival going from town to town, screaming and yelling at various school boards. And we're seeing the same thing now on these college campuses. It's all political theater by wealthy conservatives who failed to earn their way into positions of leadership and whose money has failed to give them leadership positions at these schools. So instead, they're using their money to attack those who did earn those spots. See, it's only a tiny handful of individuals who are behind all of this performative extremism that we've been subjected to for the last several years, but they have hundreds of millions, or in the case of Amman, billions of dollars at their disposal. So they can very easily pay people to go out day after day and pretend to demonstrate or protest for whatever these donors want. And when the white media mindlessly reports on this and refuses to tell the public, hey, these people you're seeing in front of your cameras screaming and yelling at school boards and other places, you do know that they're being paid to do this, right? When the white media refuses to tell the truth, this gives the public the false impression that there's some sort of grassroots support for these stunts, when in reality it's all paid for by the same handful of wealthy white ideologues. Only a few individuals leveraging billions of dollars. Another of these right-wing sock puppet groups has given itself the cynical and fraudulent name Accuracy in Media. I have to wonder what right-wing think tank dreamt of that name. They had some trucks with signs on them rolling around Harvard's campus saying Claudine Gay is the best friend Hamas ever had, and that she's refusing to protect Jewish students, etc. They were doing this on that college campus, and yet nobody was calling that hate speech. Nobody was saying that they need to be shut down or run out. These guys were doing this for days on end, and they even went to her home, by the way. And what was Amman's response to that? He claimed that, well, I don't approve of them going to her home, but he also applauded these doxing trucks, and he said that this defamation campaign would teach Claudine Gay some empathy. This is a racist throwing a temper tantrum. He actually has the nerve to wonder why she doesn't return his phone calls. He's like a psycho boyfriend who demands that his girlfriend pick up the phone whenever he calls, and that he has a right to monopolize her time and control her life. He makes racist remarks about how she came to be Harvard's president, and then he can't understand why she doesn't want to talk to him. This is how thick a bubble this guy lives in. Having lots of money is not a sign of intelligence, any more than being really tall is a sign of virtue. The things don't have anything to do with one another. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not necessarily qualified to give a medical diagnosis, but that's okay because this Amman fellow, he's not exactly an academic either, but he feels free to give his opinion on things. I think this guy needs to be in therapy. From where I sit, his obsession with destroying Claudine Gay shows that this man is not mentally stable. He sees her as a proxy for the black community in general. When he's making his racist remarks about her, when he's trying to say she's not qualified to be here or to otherwise scandalize her, he feels like he's doing it against all black people. This is the culture of America's highest educational institution. Its alumni are not the best and brightest, they're the most entitled and the most whiny. It's like a kindergarten with no adult supervision. For places that claim to be all about high test scores, they are the epitome of it's not what you know, it's who you know. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Charlie, Sakina Collins, G. Mars, Dominic Harris, and Terry White. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.